everyone, and welcome to the Liverpool Irish Festival. We're delighted to have you with us today. I'm just going to talk for a moment to let you know that we're here, that we're in, and while other people join us, it's lovely to have all of you here. We'd love to see your faces if you're able to come on camera. If you're not, that's absolutely fine. Just to give you a little bit about the setup for today, Dara will talk for around 3/4 of an hour, and after that I will come back to you all and invite questions. If you have a pressing question during the presentation, please feel free to send it over in the chat so it isn't lost. I'm very happy to pick that up, but we'll try and do the presentation all the way through and then come back for questions. We're really delighted to have Dara with us today. He is now Assistant Director of Global Irish Studies at Georgetown University. Sorry, I've just got myself tongue-tied there. Put my teeth back in. Really lovely to see you all. Thank you ever so much. I'm going to pass over to Dara now.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that very kind introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here this afternoon, this morning on Liverpool time. I'm only sorry to say that I can't be with you here in person, but I would like to get on the record and in the recording that it is my intention to be there with you in person next year for next year's festival. And I should say again, a word of congratulations to Emma. 21 is usually the year of coming of age in many different cultures. And of course, this year marks 21 years of the Liverpool Irish Festival, and to congratulate you and your team on such a wonderful and wide-ranging program on this significant anniversary. And of course, today's lecture fits into the theme of the festival, which is anniversaries. So I think it's entirely apropos that we discuss what has been ultimately a decade of anniversaries over the last 10 plus years, the so-called decade of centenaries, which marked events such as Irish independence, partition, and civil war. And today's lecture, which is the focus for the next 45 minutes or so, is based on a new publication, my new book, entitled Conflict, Diaspora and Empire, Irish Nationalism in Britain, 1912 to 1922, just published by Cambridge University Press. And at the center of that story, I try to integrate the Irish in Britain, and for today's lecture, the Irish in Liverpool, into those decade of centenaries anniversaries. So to begin, I'm just going to share my screen with you. Now, hopefully you will be able to see.
We're in PowerPoint, we're not on the show.
Okay, have we transitioned?
You will.
Okay, great, excellent. So to begin, the actions of Irish nationalists in Britain, when assessed in relation to the development of the Irish Revolution, have been characterized to date as marginal, an adjunct, and a sideshow to the political events in Ireland between 1912 and 1922. This study interrogates that marginality thesis, arguing conversely that Irish nationalism in Britain was in fact integral to both Irish and British contemporary assessments of the Irish Revolution between the Third Home Rule Bill and the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Situating Irish nationalism within this broader historical conjuncture, this study submits that mainland Britain was in fact recognised by both Irish and British political leaders, respectively, as an important theatre of Irish political influence from the Home Rule crisis to the Anglo-Irish War. So examining the mobilisation of Irish Home Rule and Republican campaigns across Britain, this research demonstrates that Irish nationalists in British centres, from Irish Party to the IRA, were critical interlocutors in the resolution of the Irish question. And one of the key figures in this study, of course, is that of T.P. O'Connor, the Liverpool-based MP for the Irish Party, who had observed presciently in 1917, the Irishman in Britain occupies a curious middle place between the nationality to which he belongs and the race among which he lives. unquote. And it is that framing device, that curious middle place between Irish history and British history, where I want to situate today's lecture, and in which I think the Irish and Britain are incredibly important and perhaps have been underwritten in the historiography to date. So for the purposes of today's lecture, I'm going to outline the key areas of inquiry of my book, chapter by chapter, and then use case studies from Irish nationalism in Liverpool to illuminate those arguments. Okay. So chapter 1 examines the impact of Irish nationalism in British centres during the so-called Home Rule crisis, from the Irish Party's Home Rule campaign to the Irish Volunteers' preparations for civil war. It profiles the political languages and cultures of the quote-unquote British Home Rule movement, examines the influence of extra-parliamentary crises, for example, the Ulster crisis, the suffragist crisis, the trade unionist crisis, on Irish nationalist identity, but also assesses the militancy of advanced nationalist activism in metropolitan Britain by July 1914. Now, the key argument here is that far from the view that Home Rule had been secured by the Liberal Irish Party alliance at the general elections in 1910, of which there were two, this chapter argues conversely that the Irish Party's exhaustive British political campaign to secure popular support for Home Rule beyond Westminster was in anticipation of a potential snap election between 1912 and 1914. So the idea that Home Rule was not guaranteed despite the Irish Liberal Party alliance, there could be a snap election in which the Conservatives came back to power, and that the Irish Party needed to win over their British populace in support of Home Rule. A central feature of this argument is the idea of the two faces of Home Rule, which you can see in this title, which argues that the Irish Party in Britain presented two faces of the Home Rule argument to Irish audiences, but also to British public audiences. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, a key figure in this story of the two faces of Home Rule was T.P. O'Connor, who I can present to you here on the right, who was the Irish Party MP for Liverpool, Scotland, the only Irish Parliamentary Party member elected outside of the island. Quite remarkable. And of course, he went the well-traveled route of the kind of Home Rule movement. He followed closely in the footsteps of Parnell, his political mentor, standing behind him on political platforms across Britain in the late 19th century and chronicling his life in a series of biographical studies. He would then become the leader of the Irish National League of Great Britain and later the United Irish League of Great Britain. And as I mentioned earlier, he was the only Irish Party MP to represent a British constituency, a position he held between 1885 and 1929. So I think it's quite correct and appropriate that Roy Foster would remark of T.P. O'Connor that he was the quintessential Mick on the make. So if we look at the Home Rule crisis, what I've established in the book is the extent to which it was defined by print culture. Many historians before have focused on the arguments, the debates at Westminster. I'm looking at the dissemination of ideas beyond Westminster in British cities, including Liverpool. And T.P. O'Connor, who I featured earlier, was really at the heart of this propaganda campaign to promote the idea of Home Rule. O'Connor, as many of our attendees I'm sure will know, was considered the founding father of the new journalism in Britain. He was the owner of the Star newspaper, and his editorial style combined sharp, accessible writing on current affairs with eye-catching headlines and popular news stories. To the extent that TP, as he became more popularly known, was such a household name across Britain. And it was T.P. O'Connor's unique journalistic profile, I would argue, which gave the Irish Party access to the dining room discussions and the breakfast room debates, which defined Home Rule in the Edwardian period. He later published pieces on Home Rule in his popular journal, TP's Weekly, and a regular political column in Reynolds' newspaper. And he also argued and advocated for the Irish in Britain, to the point that he was known by his compatriots as, quote unquote, the champion of the industrial Lazarus, unquote. Now, T.P. O'Connor was not on his own representing the Irish party in Britain. There were what the renowned Liverpool scholar John Belcham has termed other ethnic entrepreneurs and cultural brokers. Among those who was also part of the Irish party in Liverpool was Austin Harford, who at the time served as a municipal councillor on Liverpool City Council, later becoming mayor or Lord Mayor of Liverpool. And his advocacy at this time was not only for home rule for Ireland, but for the rights of Irish residents in Liverpool. For example, as a chairman of the council's housing committee, he was in charge of the construction of 2,000 domiciles in the Irish working class ward of Liverpool, Scotland by 1912. So the likes of T.P. O'Connor and Austin Harford as part of the Irish Party were the respectable face, you might say, of the Home Rule movement in Britain, and were part of what I've termed British Ireland, a part of the political culture of the Edwardian period. Other activists, however, were radicalized by the events of the time, most notably the Ulster Crisis, which saw the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1913 and the subsequent establishment of the Irish Volunteer Force later that year. The Liverpool Catholic Herald newspaper recorded of the latter event, the formation of the Irish Volunteers, quote, has piqued the interest of all the young Catholic men in the city, unquote. And indeed, we would see that in the St. Patrick's Day festival of that year, where approximately 3,200 Liverpool Irish volunteers were seen to march through the city streets of Merseyside. Thereafter, the Liverpool Irish Volunteers in their training were taking on route marches through Greenwich Park, which, as many of you probably know, is adjacent to Aintree Racecourse. Now, the significance of paramilitary organizations on the streets of Liverpool, which bore the insignia of the Irish Volunteers, goes far beyond the idea of parading for Ireland. And there was the real prospect of an Irish civil war breaking out in Merseyside and in Lancashire more broadly. And this, of course, speaks to what some have called the politics of place. Many Catholics and Protestants of Irish descent lived cheek by jowl in the city of Liverpool in this period, and there were well-known sectarian outbreaks of sectarian violence. And so it was naturally a concern that any potential civil war on the issue of Home Rule and Ulster might break out on the streets of Liverpool. And this was an ongoing concern. For example, in 1914, there were rumors that Orangemen were rioting in nationalist areas of Liverpool, and this prompted the Wigan Irish Volunteers from the nearby area to mobilize their volunteers for a potential battle on the streets of Liverpool against the UVF. And it is estimated by the summer of 1914 that there were 10,000 members of the Ulster Volunteer Force in Liverpool. So the spectre of civil war on mainland Britain was ever present, certainly in the streets of Liverpool, as we approached the summer of 1914. Of course, a very different conflict would break that deadlock. On the 4th of August, 1914, the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland went to war with Germany. Now, this historical fact, for much of the 20th century, has belied historiographical truism. Ireland and the First World War, F.X. Martin diagnosed as late as 1967, was quite simply the subject of national amnesia. The consequent scholarship of Terence Denman, David Fitzpatrick, and David Murphy, among others, has been somewhat of a palliative to Irish historical memory. So Irish historical studies since then have finally begun to recognize the significance of the Irish contribution to the First World War and the Irish contribution to the British armed forces. And by the year 2008, John Horne and a series of distinguished contributors could lend claim to the title, Our War. So chapter 2 in the book examines the contribution of Irish people resident in Britain to the First World War, specifically the British armed forces. And it, for example, profiles the languages, the motivations, and the mobilizations of some 150,000 recruits of Irish residents in British centres into the British Army by the summer of 1916, a figure which again is never included in the overall tabulations of Irish contributions to the First World War. But it also continues the examination of Irish home rule politics in the First World War. And there is a view in the established historiography that there was a break in political life in Britain during this period. And I would argue to the contrary. My chapter in my book suggests rather that the Edwardian politics of the Home Rule Party was maintained and continued during the First World War. Don't forget that many believed the war would be a short war. We'll be home before the leaves fall, was the well-worn ditty at the time. And so, of course, for John Redmond, T.P. O'Connor, and the Irish Party leadership, they believed that their recruitment of Irish men into the British Armed Forces would serve as a political lever once the war ended and a general election was resumed. And so I argue that in contradistinction to the view that John Redmond's quote-unquote recruitment of Irish volunteers signified a pro-imperial politics damaging to the Irish Party, the chapter argues that British platform patriotism performed by Irish Party leaders denoted a consciously political strategy, which I have termed home front nationalism. For example, T.P. O'Connor, who I mentioned earlier, addressed recruitment rallies across Great Britain between the 21st and 8th November. Speaking at Liverpool on 21st of September 1914, O'Connor identified Irish nationalists clearly with the imperial project. Quote, "Our empire is founded on freedom, on free institutions, on the respect for nationality. Every Irishman who can go to the front should rage himself in this fight," unquote. And again, this is all part of a strategy, I would argue, this idea of a pro-imperial politics and a pro-imperial rhetoric, with the idea that the home rule movement will be given respectability and ultimately reward in an upcoming general election. So again, this is a very much part of British political maneuvering on the part of Irish nationalist leaders. But this home front nationalism was also represented elsewhere in terms of the Irish volunteer movement, which I mentioned earlier. And Austin Harford, who of course was a member of the municipal council, sought to kind of remobilize the Liverpool Irish volunteers in part on the home front to again show the loyalty of the Irish community to the British war effort. At a meeting of Irish councillors on the 22nd of August, Harford and others proposed to assemble a Liverpool Irish volunteer force as a means of helping the civic and military authorities in the present crisis. And he claimed the volunteers for the municipal cause. He stated, quote, "They," meaning Irish nationalists, "had interests vital and lasting, which it would be essential for them to protect, even when home rule became law. In Liverpool, they would always have to defend their churches from the attacks of their enemies, while they should all times be ready to lend a helping hand in Ireland should their services be needed," unquote. So Harford is suggesting not only to go to the front, but if you are to stay at home, to be of service to the Irish Party, to the Irish question, and ultimately to Irish interests in the city of Liverpool, protecting specifically the Catholic Irish community. Now, again, going with this idea of what some have termed a staged managed British patriotism, we can see that T.P. O'Connor in his journalistic expertise seeks to promote the Irish contribution to the war in terms of print culture. And he was, along with John Redmond, an editor and author in a series of publications entitled At the Front, which sought to highlight the contributions of Irish units in the British Army. For example, the Liverpool Irish at Festubert, the London Irish at Luce, and with the Tyneside Irish at La Boisselle. And these publications were disseminated quite widely. T.P. O'Connor himself would send private copies to King George V to again demonstrate the loyalty and the contribution of the Irish volunteers. And in so doing, O'Connor was very consciously appropriating the contribution of 150,000 ordinary Irish volunteers from British centres who had enlisted in the British Army. So again, I think there is a continuation of home rule politics on the home front during the First World War, and Liverpool was certainly at the centre of that continued politics. Now, many of you will recognize this phrase, England's difficulty, Ireland's opportunity. I would like to question that well-worn aphorism in respect of the Irish nationalists who we're going to look at in chapter 3. And these include some 87 Irish men and women who participated in the 1916 Rising in Dublin, as opposed to fighting in the trenches for the British armed forces. Now, much has been made of the impact of the United States on the Easter Rebellion, and this is captured memorably in Joe Lee's memorable aphorism, quote, "No America, no New York, no Easter Rising," unquote. Wonderfully eloquent and erudite, terse aphorism, which captures the contribution of the United States to the 1916 Rising. Much less, however, has been said of the British lives of the 1916 leaders and the significance of that to our understanding of that event in both Irish and British history. For example, James Connolly was born in Edinburgh. Roger Casement had lived and loved in London. And indeed, all of the signatories to the 1916 proclamation had spent some time in British cities. To give you one example of that, Thomas Clarke, who is pictured here on the left, of course, was born on the Isle of Wight, would later serve time in British prisons for his participation in the Fenian campaigns of the 1880s. But even in the early 20th century, he was very much connected to the Liverpool Irish Republican Brotherhood. For example, in 1912, Thomas Clarke was summoned to the Morning Star Public House in Birkenhead by the IRB in Liverpool for his support of the Young Turks of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the city, who advocated for a rising 4 years before the Easter Rebellion. Now, Clarke was ultimately acquitted of any wrongdoing, but he still was clearly very well acquainted with the young Liverpool Irish Republicans who would later take part in the 1916 Rising. Given their collective British experiences in terms of the 1916 leaders, therefore, it would be remiss not to acknowledge the lack of consideration of a British front for the 1916 Rising. This, of course, had been the strategy of the Fenian movement in the late 19th century, where successive military campaigns had targeted British cities specifically to try and end British rule in Ireland. Moreover, the Irish Republican Brotherhood Supreme Council contained a representative for the north of England, which was a delegate from Liverpool throughout this period. So I think the absence of planning for military action in British cities as part of the 1916 Rising would, I think, further support the idea of the Rising as a symbolic act of insurrection, rather than simply an attempt at military victory, wherein the IRB and the Irish Volunteers in Liverpool, among others, would have been very useful auxiliary in military terms. It's clear in my mind that the Rising's leaders became preoccupied over time by the symbolic resonance of rebellion in Dublin, rather than a United Kingdom-wide rising. Ultimately, 87 men and women resident in Britain would take part in the Easter Rising. Among them, of course, were the so-called Liverpool Lambs. And you can see some of those figures here. We have the famous King family, George, Patrick, and John, all of whom took part in the 1916 Rising. And I know Peter King, their great nephew, composed a really insightful and eloquent play to mark the centenary in 2016 of the Liverpool Lambs, one of the great successes of the centenaries over the last decade. But I think these volunteers in Britain and Liverpool in particular are deserving of closer historical attention. After all, to be an Irish volunteer in Britain in 1916 was ultimately to be a soldier without a country. Those who remained part of the Liverpool Irish Volunteers had refused to join the British Army. They similarly had refused to join Austin Harford's Liverpool National Volunteers to protect the municipal cause in Liverpool. and they were yet to be aware of the plans for the 1916 Rising. So there was something quite radical about being a Liverpool Irish volunteer as late as 1915 and 1916, such as the Kings. Indeed, a mere 50 of the original 1,000 Irish National Volunteers retained the title of Irish Volunteer during the First World War. Many, of course, were members of the Bootle Gaelic League and were inspired by cultural nationalism and so on. And such was their such was the kind of the lack of support for their cause that they were forced by the Merseyside police to assemble for firing practices in a basement on Scotland Road. So what caused those people to maintain this allegiance to the Irish volunteers and their aspiration of a republic? Well, I would suggest that reading was a formative influence for many members of the Irish volunteers, but also Cumann na Man, based in Liverpool. Starved of Irish history in the British education system, reading about Ireland's 700 years was ultimately the preserve of the autodidact. For example, Liverpool volunteer Tom Craven, whose diary is a wonderful insight into this period, stated, "Every book concerning Ireland that came within my reach was eagerly studied by me. I used to dream of being a soldier fighting for Ireland. With the egotism of youth in my dreams, I was always the Robert Emmet or Wolfe Tone of the enterprise." And of course, the reading culture of the Liverpool Irish Volunteers was centered on specific places. Peter Murphy's shop on Liverpool Scotland Road would stock an assortment of radical journals, most notably Irish Freedom, which was the journal of record of the IRB. And it was Tom Craven, having read all of these journals and books, who aspired to be the next Wolfe Tone or Robert Emmet, who would actually propose to Sean McDermott of the 1916 leaders that they should have fighting in Liverpool. He argued for a diversion during the 1916 Rising, doing whatever damage we could to the port of Liverpool when the fighting came off in Ireland. Ultimately, that event did not take place, but it would some 4 years later. Now, the penultimate chapter of the book, chapter 4, deals with the quote-unquote war of words, the propaganda campaign between Britain and Ireland during the War of Independence period, and looking at the importance of British cities to that propaganda effort. And the figure I've highlighted here on the right, of course, is P.J. Kelly, the Liverpool councillor, who would ultimately become the president of the Irish Self-Determination League of Great Britain, which was the main propagandist body of the time. He had been formerly an Irish Party supporter, so right behind T.P. O'Connor. He had supported the interned rebels after the 1916 Rising, but he now became the face of the new nationalist movement. And there is that kind of well-worn aphorism about the new Republican movement, old wine in new bottles. And to a certain extent, P.J. Kelly was the kind of representation of that. He was a former Irish Party loyalist turned advanced Irish nationalist. And the significance, of course, of propaganda in Britain at this time for Irish nationalism is that Sinn Féin, the party of choice of the Irish people after the 1918 election, had very vocally proclaimed that they would abstain from attending Westminster, and they would not be taking their seats in the Houses of Parliament to advance the cause of Ireland, against the policy of the Irish Party. And with that was a major loss of propaganda. So the Irish Party were daily speaking in Westminster, and as I demonstrated earlier, disseminating propaganda for 2 British cities. So Irish nationalists in Britain, the ISDL, and also Sinn Féin were really important to maintain the publicity for the Irish nationalist cause at the height of the War of Independence, to the extent that British Prime Minister David Lloyd George would term Irish nationalists in Great Britain natural propagandists. So praise indeed from the British PM of the day. But I want to focus as part of this example on Liverpool again and their contribution, and one case study in particular, and it is what I would term a post-war radical moment in the Irish story of this period. So in April 1920, we see a major hunger strike undertaken at Wormwood Scrubs in London by Irish prisoners. Upwards of 217 Irish internees at Wormwood Scrubs prison go on hunger strike against their imprisonment because they want to be considered political prisoners. And this prompts a major series of protests by Irish nationalists in London, which is directed by the ISDL. And within 24 hours, 5,000 supporters had gathered outside the prison, displaying Sinn Féin flags, banners. As you can see from the image, they used loudspeakers to communicate to the hunger strikers behind the cell walls. And these scenes were recreated on 6 successive nights, building to approximately 40,000 people attending these protests in London. They were ultimately discontinued on the 1st of May because of counter protests by some British radicals. And again, these are the scenes in British cities of the ongoing conflict. But most seriously of all, the Liverpool Irish Self-Determination League issued an ultimatum to the British government on the 27th of April, 1920, threatening to call a strike of the city's some 200,000 Irish workers within 48 hours if the internees were not released. Now, the threat of industrial action posed by the Liverpool ISDL specifically was taken very seriously by the British establishment, most notably by Basil Thomson, who was the head of the Home Office Directorate of Intelligence, who had been very concerned about the possibility of industrial action and post-war radicalism after the First World War. And this is exacerbated by the fact that we're approaching May Day in the British Labour calendar. But also a few weeks earlier, there had been hunger strikes at Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, which had seen major industrial action across Ireland. And so there was a considerable threat at this moment in April of 1920 of a United Kingdom-wide industrial action, which would have completely destabilized the authority of British rule in Ireland. And Thomson is reporting on these issues to the British cabinet, considering the threat of the Liverpool Irish nationalists very seriously indeed. So the reality, however, on the ground was somewhat different. PJ Kelly, the leader of the ISDL in Liverpool, did not ultimately have the support of the National Union of Dock, Riverside and General Workers, which ironically was led by James Sexton, the Lancashire-raised activist of Irish descent. And the eventual strike on the Liverpool docks amounted to a mere 2,000 dock labourers and 300 coal heavers. So Basil Thomson, from his office in London, his revolutionary or radical moment had only existed on paper. But nonetheless, this was a significant milestone in the Irish nationalist movement. The very threat of a radical moment signified their potential political impact. And I think that we have to pay attention to the discourse that they channeled to establish their support and momentum for their cause. So organized responses to the hunger strikes in Liverpool specifically were not merely driven by the momentum of events in Ireland, they were channeled through the specific theme of civic and industrial protest. Political language, ritual, and ultimately public space, for example, the use of the docks, were each employed to anchor, no pun intended, the Irish question in this contemporary discourse on the city's port area. So the ISDL strike in the city's port encouraged participants to picket along a 3-mile stretch of docks. And Michael Collins observed from afar about the symbolic resonance of this use of this radical moment. He said, "The Wormwood Scrubs strike will form the rallying point for the previously lost members of our exiles abroad," unquote. And he was quite correct. By the end of May, membership of the Irish Self-Determination League had jumped to 11,764, while the number of branches had risen to 111. So Irish residents in Britain, specifically in Liverpool, responded to a kind of recognizable form of radical politics in support of Irish nationalism. And even in the poster you can see here where they're encouraging people to strike, these are spaces along the Liverpool docks, Milford Street, St. George's Place, and so on, which are obviously St. George's Hall, for example, adjacent to the docks. And so speaking to a kind of an industrial action moment, which is a kind of the language of British Irish radicalism, I would suggest. And moving on to our final chapter, an Anglo-Irish War. So this chapter explores the political effects of the Republican military campaigns in Britain from the conclusion of the Rising to the conclusion of the War of Independence in July 1921. Now, among the themes which it explores, which I won't go into today, but I'm happy to answer questions on, are, for example, the fascinating circles of intrigue which Irish nationalists involved themselves, specifically in Liverpool, to obtain arms to supply the IRA in Ireland. And this involved trading with criminal gangs, communists, and demobilized soldiers in the kind of criminal underworld of Liverpool in 1919, 20, and 1921. So it's a fascinating insight. And there are, for example, some stories which have echoes of the Peaky Blinders, for example, in terms of Irish nationalists trading arms with British gangs during this period. And Liverpool was really the hub of those kind of arms trade, which Collins, I would suggest, oversaw. And that's a key point which I think distinguishes my book from the work of others who've explored that area, is that in contradistinction to the kind of loosely organized IRB arms smuggling rings in Liverpool and elsewhere, my research establishes that British IRB sections were under the direction of Collins in Dublin, and that he sought to integrate Liverpool, London, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and other British cities into an interconnected arms system, which was specially designed to support and sustain the IRA in the field during the War of Independence. And this is critical ultimately to the success of the War of Independence from the Republican side. But for the purposes of today's presentation, I want to focus just on a different angle to that theme, and that is specifically the IRA campaign in Britain, and the importance of that campaign, which I think has been misunderstood in the historiography to date. So in contradistinction to the traditional view that IRA attacks were emotionally driven acts of reprisal simply initiated by local volunteers in British cities, my research documents the influence of Collins and IRA GHQ over the campaign in Britain and the strategic logic underpinning IRA attacks in British centres. And ultimately, the book evaluates the threat of IRA violence in Liverpool and Britain more widely, in conjunction with events in Ireland, something which British political leaders in Downing Street did at that time. More on that in a moment. So the opening salvo of a GHQ-directed offensive in Britain was initially thought or proposed to be a synchronous attack in Liverpool, Manchester, and London in November of 1920. And the idea was to blow up the Liverpool docks. There would be attacks on the power stations in Manchester and the burning of warehouses in London. And the seriousness of these plans were revealed in Ernie O'Malley's diary entry of the 1st of November, which was later discovered. He stated, quote, "England to go up in lumps, also intelligence officers in Dublin." Now, what did O'Malley mean by that latter comment? He effectively meant that the famous or infamous attack of Bloody Sunday in Dublin, orchestrated by Michael Collins against the British intelligence officers, the Cairo Gang, were intended to be carried out in conjunction with the attacks in Britain, including in Liverpool. That ultimately did not arise. And in the wake of Bloody Sunday, the British authorities in Dublin captured the plans for the IRA attacks in Liverpool, and these ultimately were scuppered. But it is important to note that, as many contemporary observers noted, the threat of an IRA attack on the Liverpool docks really generated enormous concern at the highest points of British policymaking, at Whitehall, at Westminster, to the point that barriers were erected outside Downing Street and bodyguards were assigned to British cabinet members. This is for the attacks that did not take place. So that was the threat of any IRA presence on British soil during this period. However, on the 27th of November 1920, a limited form of an IRA attack did take place. Explosions were reported along the Liverpool docks, which saw, for example, the burning of 8 timber yards adjacent to the Liverpool docks and a further 7 warehouses in nearby Bootle. Now, this was originally part of a diversionary tactic as part of the overall initial campaign to destroy the Liverpool docks, so it wasn't even the feature event. So you might think that set against the IRA's great expectations, this would be considered a failure. But if you look at the headlines, which I've presented here in the slide of the newspaper reports from the national press of that day, you can see that this is a major event in British political life at the time. The very limited IRA attack, which did take place, captured headlines and caught the public imagination. Still, these attacks have again simply been considered a sideshow to events in Ireland during this time. And there's a justification for that. As I mentioned, the 21st of November 1920 was the events of Bloody Sunday in Dublin, the killing of British intelligence operatives by Michael Collins' squad. On the 28th of November, a week later, at Kilmichael in County Cork, Tom Barry and his IRA volunteers were carried out major attacks on British auxiliaries, the single biggest death toll of British auxiliaries in the War of Independence. And these two events have been considered the kind of twin peaks of the IRA campaign at the time. And sandwiched somewhere in between are the Liverpool attacks on the Liverpool docks. But yet still, many contemporary observers, including British political leaders, considered the IRA attacks in Liverpool as extremely significant. For example, the threat of the IRA in Liverpool and Britain more widely was discussed at 3 separate cabinet meetings between the 21st of November 1920 and the 5th of December 1920, more than either Bloody Sunday or Kilmichael. In the absence of reliable intelligence from Basil Thomson, the British cabinet was forced to turn to the public for information, and Winston Churchill offered £5,000 of his personal wealth to find out information, stating, "I would pay up to £5,000 reward for a hanging case." Indeed, it was in response to the threat of Liverpool, the IRA in Liverpool, much less that of Dublin, that David Lloyd George referred to the present menacing attitude of the Sinn Féiners. So the British cabinet actually considered the IRA attack in Liverpool, as small scale as it was, a part of a coordinated IRA offensive at this time. How could they otherwise have thought? It took place days after Bloody Sunday and 1 day prior to the events of Kilmichael. So the IRA in Britain were considered integral by British political leaders to the overall IRA campaign and should be evaluated as such. But this has not been the case in the historiography to date. For example, when you exploring the peace discussions in December 1920, which followed these attacks, Ronan Fanning has attributed British mediation to the events of Bloody Sunday and Kilmichael, with no reference to the IRA attack in Liverpool. Michael Hopkinson, the doyen of Irish historians of the War of Independence, has talked about the impact of the events of Bloody Sunday and Kilmichael as the beginning of British martial law in Ireland, again, with no reference to the IRA attack in Liverpool. However, as I have established, the threat of IRA action in Britain, specifically in Liverpool, was in fact a central preoccupation for British policymakers on Ireland up until the Truce of July 1921. So, some concluding remarks. Far from a marginal sideshow to developments in Ireland, I would argue that Irish nationalism in Britain was integral to both Irish and British contemporary assessments of the Irish Revolution. Successive Irish political leaders recognized mainland Britain as an important theatre of Irish political influence, from the Third Home Rule Bill ultimately to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. John Redmond and Michael Collins directed significant and sustained campaigns of propaganda and political violence in British cities in support of their respective nationalist ambitions. So from the Ulster crisis to the British reprisals crisis of the War of Independence, almost every leading Irish nationalist figure of the revolutionary period travelled across the Irish Sea to address audiences in British cities. John Dillon, Joseph Devlin, Countess Markievicz, James Connolly, Thomas Clarke, Patrick Pearse, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, and Arthur Griffith. As noted, British-based Irish nationalist leaders such as T.P. O'Connor were further critical interlocutors of the Home Rule and Irish Republican movements, respectively, and they mediated on the potential resolution of the Irish question with successive British prime ministers, from Herbert Asquith to David Lloyd George. And it's really important, again, that we don't see Irish nationalism in Britain as coterminous with Westminster. Irish nationalists in Britain mobilised popular political interest and activism on an unprecedented scale in British cities across this decade. Almost 300,000 people attended Home Rule meetings between 1912 and 1914. Over 150,000 Irish men in British cities enlisted in the British Armed Forces, and a further 140,000 people participated in Irish Self-Determination League campaigns across England and Wales in 1920. Ultimately, Irish nationalist activism in Britain generated documentary interest from every major government department during this period: Home Office, Colonial Office, War Office, Justice Office, and Cabinet Office. The potent influence of Irish nationalism in British cities, exemplified by Liverpool, occupied the minds and minutes of senior British policymakers from Winston Churchill to David Lloyd George. So as a postscript, I'm going to return to where we began with our dear friend T.P. O'Connor, the Irish Party member for Liverpool, Scotland. Cut adrift from the internecine divisions of the later Irish Civil War, T.P. O'Connor in 1922 penned a letter to John Dillon, the leader of the Irish Party, from his Liverpool constituency office, proposing the rehabilitation of Irish nationalist politics in Britain through the reformation of the Irish Party in that city. Quote, "It would be fatal for us as a race in Great Britain to throw down our arms, at least in this generation. We have to right the question of the Catholic schools, and we have to push the political fortunes of our countrymen so as to raise the level of the Irish race in power and public opinion here, of giving opportunities to the most promising young boys and girls of our people to complete their education and train themselves for higher things than simply blind alley employment and the hardest and most ill-paid labour in this country," unquote. Irish nationalism, however, John Dillon replied, could never return to Britain in this form in the wake of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. He concluded, stating, "Its programme belongs to a closed chapter of Irish history." Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Dara. I'm inviting everyone to unmute so that we can give you a round of applause before we start the Q&A. Thanks, everyone. Now, I haven't had any questions come through the chat, but I guess my first question would be, if that's the extent to which Liverpool responded, did other cities have similar levels of engagement in that home rule question and the drives towards it?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I would say that Liverpool, because T.P. O'Connor was the elected MP for Liverpool, Scotland, was certainly the heartland of the Home Rule movement in Britain at that time. And it had been prior to that. We have Charles Stewart Parnell basically basing kind of the Irish Party framework and structures in Liverpool as well. So it certainly was the kind of visible homeland for Irish home rule politics. But that being said, we have like Irish party leaders like John Redmond, I mentioned earlier, Joseph Devlin, speaking on platforms across British cities between 1912 and 1914. Approximately 500 meetings in 1912 alone were attended by Irish Party members who not only sat at Westminster, the kind of well-established history of the period really documents that very well, but also were kind of on their weekends and so on, were traveling to these British constituencies to try and inform public debate and so on. And very interestingly, sometimes they were stood beside the likes of Winston Churchill or other British political leaders to kind of signify the relevance of the Home Rule question to British policymakers at that time. So other British cities were definitely giving platforms to Irish party leaders, but Liverpool was the kind of political home of the Home Rule movement of Britain.
Thanks, Dara. Can I invite anybody else to raise a hand, ask a question, make an observation? I mean, TP O'Connor sounds like an incredible person, and he keeps on coming up in the names of people that are mentioned. 44 years he was minister for. That seems incredibly unusual. What do you think made him such a remarkable person that he was voted in that way for so long?
Right. It's a really intriguing story, and I should again advert to the work of other scholars. L.W. Brady has written a very important study. I think it was 1983. So we're 40 years later. T.P. O'Connor and the Liverpool Irish, which kind of positions T.P. O'Connor as the kind of leader of the Liverpool Irish community specifically. I would see T.P. O'Connor in different terms. I think his longevity can be certainly attributed to the fact that he was beloved by the Liverpool Irish community. He was voted in, evidently, in that jurisdiction, in that ward. But he was something of a national figure, as I mentioned. He was a journalist par excellence. He was a well-known wit. He wrote widely. He was a prolific propagandist. He thereafter became the father of the House of Commons from 1919 because of his longevity at Westminster. And I think it's perhaps one of those great historical ironies that he was the face of Irish nationalism in Britain for, as you mentioned, some 40 years. And yet, when it came to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, it was Michael Collins, this great unknown who had risen through the ranks of Irish Republican activism, who would sit across the table from the British political elite, and not T.P. O'Connor. So he's kind of one of those tragic figures who has, to a certain extent, been lost to history. But that being said, I think he is recognized more actually in British political life than he is in Irish political life. There is a bust to him on Fleet Street. Such was his contribution to journalism. But he is certainly someone I would like to see restored to. We talk about anniversaries and memory and commemorations. He's someone I would certainly like to see restored to public memory for his contribution to British and Irish political life over almost half a century.
Thanks ever so much, Dara. There are a couple of things coming up through the chat now. Dermot O'Connor says, my father was T.P. O'Connor, born in 1910. Did the original T.P. have any children, or have they got any nieces, nephews still going now? If you happen to know the answer to that.
Oh, really interesting that the name carried on through the generations. To my knowledge, he did not have any children. He kind of had separated from his wife in the period that we're looking at. His wife was a really fascinating figure in her own right. She kind of published a memoir on her activism in the suffrage movement and so on. And TP kind of ultimately lived quite a reclusive existence. He had a residence in London in his later years. Yeah, he lived a kind of a life of isolation, which I think was probably the lot of many Irish Party members at that time in the early 20th century. They again were in the Houses of Parliament by day, and they were working for the Irish cause by night, speaking on platforms, writing articles and so on. So it was a very difficult existence. And O'Connor is also an interesting figure. There was a kind of well-worn phrase that his accent apparently changed the further he was from Dublin or London. Such was his ability to speak to different audiences. So I guess the idea that he had a Dublin twang when he spoke to audiences in Ireland, and when he moved across the Irish Sea, he could adopt a Liverpudlian or indeed a London accent. So he was a chameleon of sorts, who again I think is deserving of a fuller biography.
And in terms of that chameleon-esque idea, I mean, today, does that matter? Do we worry about that? Does that make him seem insincere in some way? Or do we think that that's about an amiability that he was trying to find connection with?
It's a really interesting point. Of course, as he suggests, it speaks to the contemporary period about, the sincerity and authenticity of our political leaders. And that was one of the great critiques as we moved into the period that we're focusing on today, the revolutionary period of T.P. O'Connor, the idea that he spoke outside of both sides of his mouth, right, to British audiences and Irish audiences. But as my work suggests, and the book amplifies this more broadly, that is kind of the raison d'etre of the Irish Party more broadly, this quote unquote two faces of home rule, which again, the idea of being two-faced suggests insincerity, but actually it was politically astute they knew they had to speak to Irish audiences and British audiences, whereas Sinn Féin, the next generation of Irish leaders, refused to attend Westminster, were not interested in engaging really with British public audiences, and kind of, you know, ceded the territory in that regard. The Irish Party were perhaps more skilled propagandists in those terms. They knew the political language of the Liberals. In the First World War, we see them use the language of imperialism and patriotism to again connect the Home Rule cause to the politics of the day. So I think T.P. O'Connor was certainly at the forefront of that movement, and again, a prolific propagandist. He was publishing every day. You know, so I think to a certain extent there is there was a form of democratic reportage, you could say, in that sense. He was writing every day as an MP instead of being holed up in Westminster unaccountable. He was accountable in, you know, in word form, you know, every day. And so in that regard, his kind of his record is probably unmatched in terms of what he contributed in writing.
Thanks, Dara. So a question that's come in from the floor, the room, I don't know quite what to say in these Zoom spaces, but a question that's in anyway, is you referred earlier to the gathering of arms in Britain supporting the War of Independence. Do you have any more detail on how that was organised?
Yeah, certainly. And of course, in a lecture of 40, 45 minutes, it's difficult to get everything in. And that certainly was a key feature of the period 1919 to 21. And Liverpool was, in every sense of the word, the hub, the major gateway for that arms smuggling enterprise. As I mentioned, what my book suggests is that this was a very sophisticated enterprise, certainly by the time of the truce of July 1921. Other books have suggested that was kind of individuals gathering arms in Liverpool and sending them across on the kind of on sea liners across the Irish Sea. The records that I've looked at, Michael Collins's documents, the letters of the likes of Neil Kerr, the principal IRB figure in Liverpool, really suggest and emphasize that this was ultimately, at the end of this period, a highly sophisticated and coordinated campaign, which was really vital to the campaign which Collins was organizing to supply the IRA. Just 2 days, for example, before the truce was agreed on the 11th of July, 1921, Collins is writing to Liverpool, bemoaning the lack of arms coming over the week prior. You know, he's so concerned about the kind of the drop off in arms in the week prior to the truce. So for Collins, at least, as the leader of the IRB and ultimately the leader of the guerrilla war in Ireland, the smuggling of arms from Liverpool specifically was invaluable to the IRA being a kind of a legitimate army in the field. And I should say that by 1920, all of the arms smuggling which is taking place in Glasgow, London, Birmingham, Sheffield, Manchester is being routed through the IRB connections in Liverpool. So the Liverpool docks are really the fulcrum by 1920 of all of those arms smuggling. And it's because of the Irish community presence, the support networks, but also the likes of Neil Kerr, this kind of the kind of grey-haired kind of Fenian of the Liverpool IRB, who, you know, was well versed in how to smuggle arms. Steve Lanigan, who worked in customs and excise, was a useful asset. And Collins is writing to all those figures day by day. So Liverpool is really instrumental in allowing a war of independence to take place.
Thanks, Dara. I'm going to hand over to Maggie Chetty now, who's got a question for you. Just bear with us, Maggie. You're on. Yeah, there you go.
It's our belief through work done here in Scotland in 2016 that more arms were collected in Scotland than anywhere else. This was by people like John McLean and the miners, Glasgow Irish communities, Cummanda Barn, and people, suffragists like Margaret Skinnada. I thought it would be interesting for people to hear that. Do you have a comment, Dara, on that?
Thank you, Maggie, for that observation. And I think it's a really thoughtful point of discussion. I would have kind of circumstantial evidence to support that. If you look at Collins's man on the ground in Scotland, his IRB kind of brother, so to speak. It was Joe Vyse, who was kind of his person on the ground. And in his letters to Collins, which are basically week by week up until 1920, certainly, he's talking in grandiose terms about being able to secure arms from, for example, Maryhill barracks, from demobilized soldiers and so on. And Collins, interestingly, is so enamored by the possibility of arms from Scotland and the volumes involved that he sends IRB money to secure that, because, as you probably are aware, GHQ in Dublin was not necessarily did not necessarily show the same initiative as Collins did in this enterprise. And Collins was keenly aware that, you know, you had to kind of strike while the iron is hot, so to speak. And he basically authorized about £500 was the term figure I saw, which is a huge amount of money at the time, for Vyse to secure those arms from Maryhill barracks and other army installations. So I don't have the numbers to kind of back that up, but certainly the circumstantial evidence suggests that Scotland was a major source of not only arms, but munitions from places like Motherwell, Leith, and so on. And certainly by 1921, there are about 5 IRA battalions covering Edinburgh, Glasgow, like I said, Leith, other areas. So yeah.
We pulled together a collection of essays during 2016. We Shall Rise Again, which was part of the research that was pulled together for that. And the other people who made quite a big contribution were fishermen down the west coast who took arms directly in fishing boats to Ireland.
It's fascinating, absolutely, and Scotland features very heavily in my book. So I suppose it's as good a time as ever to kind of mention, if you are interested in reading further on any of these issues, please do buy my book. We'll provide a link towards the end of this recording.
Thanks ever so much for the question, Maggie. We've had another observation come in from Roseanne McCoy, who was saying that her grandfather, James McCoy, was a coal heaver in Liverpool. So wondering how much coal heavers might have been involved in a lot of this work. Have you any comment on that at all?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, the dock strike, the putative dock strike of 1920, which really got policymakers in Whitehall very concerned. The coal heavers were at the heart of that. I think the numbers ultimately of dock strikers were limited by comparison to what they could have been. We have over 200,000 was the number cited as potentially could go on strike. So certainly they were a presence during that port strike in 1920 in this kind of industrial action moment. So it's perhaps not even what they did, but the fact that they were a presence on the docks of Liverpool and in the neighboring areas that gave them their significance. And that's really the case for a lot of Irish nationalist activism in British centres. It was the de facto potential of activism because of the, I think it was 1.5 million people claimed Irish ancestry in Britain at that time. The potential for Irish people to be mobilized on these issues, whether they actually fulfill that promise or not, was the greatest concern for British policymakers. And that's what the book tries to emphasize. A lot of the studies to date have been, the Irish in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Glasgow, and those local studies are really important and so detailed, and the amount of research is just invaluable. But what I've tried to do is to synthesize that research and evaluate the significance of the actions of people at a local level by judging how did they inform policy making in London, how were they judged by Irish nationalist leaders in Dublin and by political policymakers in London. And what I've surmised is that the Irish nationalists in British centres across this decade were, a major force to be reckoned with politically and in terms of political violence, and have certainly been not recognised within the historiography or commemorations really to date.
So before I pass to Divya, who's got a really interesting question, I've got 2 questions from Donal. He asks, how much was the threat of Sinn Féin action in Britain? Sorry, I need to rephrase this. I've not read that very well. Bear with me. Please could I ask, how much the threat of Sinn Féin action in Britain helped to bring Britain to negotiate the treaty. But he also asks, how active was the I always say this wrong, Cumann na mBan in the Merseyside area? How active was that movement? So there's two questions there, poorly phrased by me, apologies.
Sure, no problem. I'll take the last question first, if that's okay. I mean, Cumann na mBan were really important in Liverpool, especially in the War of Independence era, in terms of arms smuggling. Someone who I didn't get to mention in the presentation because of time limitations was Neil Kerr's wife, who was a really influential person in terms of smuggling of arms. And she's kind of gone unrecognized because her husband was kind of the IRB figure of the city, was arrested, was Collins' kind of connection and so on. But if you look at the military pension application of Mrs. Neil Kerr, she went by, she talks about her various roles. And in the book, I kind of separate them by her various roles. She's the mother, her sons were involved in the IRA in Liverpool during this period. One was killed tragically in an accident. She's the kind of wife. She supports Neil Kerr in his IRB activities, but she's also kind of an arms smuggler par excellence. She houses weapons and explosives in their home. She takes responsibility for prisoners, for example, when they are arrested. She deals with the British authorities when they are interning members of the IRA. So she's both a kind of activist in the gendered sense. She kind of plays both sides, the kind of paternal and maternal figure. And her military pension is really fascinating in that regard. A lot of the military pensions designate what Cumann na mBan can apply for when it comes to their pensions, so-called women's work, this category, as if there was only limited roles for women. And Neil Kerr's wife is really remarkable for transcending expected gender roles in that regard. She was a really influential figure in her own right, and I would encourage you all to read her military pension, available from the Irish Military Archives to download, and just see that 20 years later, she was still able to very accurately and eloquently describe and document her participation in that period. The first question regarding Sinn Féin action in Britain, I mean, there are two views, of course, about what happened in July 1921. Did the IRA win the war, or was it kind of British public protest at their government, which ultimately brought the ceasefire? If you take the latter view, Irish Sinn Féin in Britain were absolutely vital to informing public opinion at that time. The events, for example, of the Wormwood Scrubs hunger strike were front page headlines in April and May of 1920, leading to questions in the House of Commons from MPs across Britain about the nature of British rule in Ireland. In 1920, Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne travels across Britain. He is barred from entering Ireland, and it's the Irish Self-Determination League and Sinn Féin in British cities who promote and publicise his tour of Britain. About, as I said, 140,000 people attend events for Archbishop Mannix across Britain during this time over several months. And in the spring of 1921, the Sinn Féin and ISDL are on political platforms denouncing British rule, suggesting there's a liberal crisis of conscience because of Marshall policy in Ireland and so on. Now, the one thing you could say is that they certainly didn't reach their potential, because the Irish nationalists post-rising in Britain were not like the Irish Party. They did not want to engage with British politicians. They were, of Gaelic League heritage and GAA heritage, and believed that Irish nationalists should be divorced of British politics. So there was a reluctance to engage in lobbying of the British government. For example, in 1921, the British Labour Party have a major campaign of their own, Hands Off Ireland, and Sinn Féin and ISDL kind of engaged to a limited extent. So that's really where you could say there's a limit to their involvement. But again, read the government minutes of the time. British policymakers in London and in Dublin are saying that the ISDL and Sinn Féin are a major problem in terms of their publicity campaigns. And if you think the War of Independence was won and lost in the form of a war of words, then Sinn Féin in Britain was absolutely central to that.
Mm.
Thanks, Dara. I'm going to pass to Divya now for her question. If you can come on off mute, there you go. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, Dara. Thanks
Hi.
very much. That's really fascinating. What I was wondering about is, so with all the collections of arms in British cities, and then the need to get them to Ireland on sea crossings and stuff, that there must have been, you know, the Irish Sea is like a really interesting locus of things happening and political transfer of information and physical arms. And I just wonder, like, yeah, what you know about some of these crossings and how they were smuggled.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It's an absolutely fascinating area of research, and you're quite right. The Irish Sea itself was a site or a theatre of that conflict, and so we have, and again, Liverpool really comes to the fore and into focus here because of the expertise and the experience of seafarers on established lines from Liverpool to Dublin, but also to Dundalk and other port cities in Ireland. It's kind of Collins is laying his IRB network of arms smuggling over the existing lines of Liverpool-based seafarers on those kind of those liners which cross the Irish Sea, and he is depending on the expertise and knowledge and nous of Neil Kerr and the IRB in Liverpool, but he's also in contact with seamen directly on these liners, to the point that actually in the Dublin docks, he creates basically a branch of the IRB responsible for the intake of those arms, ammunition and explosives throughout this period. So again, this is Collins's own initiative. It's separate from IRA GHQ. It's not coordinated by the Dáil. De Valera is not aware of this. But again, interestingly, the likes of De Valera and other leaders are, gain the benefit of this, because we have political leaders like De Valera, who escapes from Lincoln prison and is then transferred across the Irish Sea secretively on these liners through Collins's network. So they're absolutely instrumental in so many different respects. And one of the ways that they get away with it is because they are, of course, professionally employed by these sea liners, but they also speak with Mancunian or Scouse accents, and many of them are British born, and so that allows them to be above suspicion. And if you read any of the memoirs of this period of anyone who took part in arms smuggling, that was a major asset, to have an accent from Liverpool, or to be well versed in the kind of customs and conventions of life in Liverpool that you often evaded capture in that respect. So this is really a Liverpool Irish story in many regards.
Has that answered you? Are you happy with that? That's great. Thank you. While I think about it, Dara, might you drop your email and the place where people can access your book into the chat? Can I just invite the audience? Can anybody give me a hand? Has anybody got any other questions that you'd like to ask before we wrap up? Because if not, Peter, have you got anything to say?
Yeah.
Did I see
Yeah.
you not lift it? Okay, Peter, can I pass to you?
Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Just to thank Dara for his excellent presentation. My great uncles were the King brothers who took part in 1916. My grandfather was the youngest of 5 brothers. And he probably would have taken part in 1916 as well, only he was the youngest, too young to take part, but he was active. Apparently, he told me that they used to store weapons in the house in Liverpool. So he took an active role in that sense, but he didn't actually travel to Ireland because he was too young. And going back to Emma's point about T.P. O'Connor, I think, the Irish influence on Liverpool was huge, mainly due to obviously the events of following the famine, the huge influx of Irish into Liverpool from the mid 1840s. And apparently T.P. O'Connor had the option of 2 seats, one in County Galway, the other obviously in the Scotland division of Liverpool, but he chose Liverpool because it was considered a safer option, which just shows, the massive influence of Liverpool and the involvement in Liverpool people in the politics of the time. Darragh, do you think, what part did the media play in trying to suppress? Obviously we know how influential the media can be today, but at the time, do you think the media played a role in trying to suppress, the involvement in of these sort of volunteers in Liverpool and other cities? Obviously, and how big a threat were they generally? This political, radical politics that you mentioned. Do you think it was a real threat to Britain generally?
Thanks so much, Peter. It's great to see you, and again, thank you so much for the work that you've done on your family and the Liverpool Irish community more generally. And I think your point is well made about the media and its potential influence during this period. I mean, one very clear example of that is in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, when, of course, in the middle of the First World War, we have censorship. So news trickling into Irish communities was really very limited, and was, of course, framed by the British state about what happened in the Rising. So your family's story would ultimately not be told for many years, and it's really important, I think. Liverpool, again, being the closest port basically to Ireland, word very often travelled of those incidents through the seafarers across the Irish Sea, and either passed along notes or so on, or messages, or through word of mouth communicated what was actually happening on the ground. One of the interesting angles which my book looks at is the importance of the kind of Catholic Irish press. I mentioned earlier the Liverpool Catholic Herald newspaper, and that was a series of 34 newspapers across Britain, which was owned and edited by Charles Diamond, some of you may know, and he offered basically news of current affairs in Britain and Ireland throughout this period, but also in each edition there were local stories as well. So I think that Irish Catholic press, which Charles Diamond was the owner of and kind of the press baron of his day, was really important to offer a unique local but also ethnic insight as to the news. And many people in Liverpool got their first news about what took place in the 1916 Rising through the Liverpool Catholic Herald, for example. And of course, we remember that in maybe the period before this, the Liverpool Catholic Times was in part edited by Piers Beasley, who of course later take part in the 1916 Rising and would be one of the great biographers of Michael Collins as well. So in that regard, the media is really important. The other thing, of course, is that as some of the headlines suggested earlier, there was an attempt to delegitimize and in fact to criminalize the Republican movement between 1919 and 1921 by the British state. The term murder gang, of course, was used to kind of, belie any political aspirations of anyone of an Irish nationalist designation during this period. And they used the term Sinn Féin for any active operation or event during this period. So there was no kind of Irish volunteer movement, according to the British authorities. They were all Sinn Féin, part of the Sinn Féin murder gang. And that's all part of the propaganda war, which I mentioned. The ISDL and Sinn Féin in British cities are desperately, prolifically trying to communicate to British public audiences that they are a legitimate, political force, that they have legitimate political aspirations, in contradistinction to the view that anyone in support of Sinn Féin is a part of the murder gang. So there is a huge media war at that time, and that's why Britain is so important between 1919 and 1921, and why Irish nationalists in British cities are so important to that story.
Good.
Thanks, Darragh. I've made a call out for any final questions, but I think actually you've
Emma, can you hear me?
Oh, Jerry, I can hear
Emma,
you.
can you hear me? Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
Emma,
you've
it's a
got a
bit
lot of
noisy
noise
here.
behind you, Jerry.
I know, that's why I haven't unmuted until now, because it's quite now. I'm in Lanigan's pub, which I believe, in Liverpool. I stayed in the hotel above overnight, which is fine. But it is Lanigan's pub. It's not being at a wood tone started. That's why I didn't.
Okay, can you ask a question, Jerry? It's quite hard.
Just to remind your listeners that Darragh's book is being reviewed this week in the Irish Post by Daniel Mulhall, and it will probably be on the Irish Post website also. It's not a question, it's just a statement of fact. Thank you.
So for anybody who didn't hear that, and I was going to do it because Jerry had already emailed me this fact, that Dan Mulhall, a former ambassador, if not an ambassador now, maybe he is still an ambassador now, but he's reviewed Dara's book, and that will be in the Irish Post this week. So for anybody who would like to read more about the publication, please have a look there. So essentially, I'd like to say thank you to Dara, but I will open up for applause shortly. Just a couple of notes. You've in the chat, Dara has put where you can find the book, so anybody who would like to purchase that can go there. Dara, can you tell people where they can find out more about you on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Jerry, for that mention earlier of Ambassador Mulhall's review. I'm really looking forward to reading it. My email is there in the chat function, and it's dara.gannon@georgetown.edu. You can find me on Twitter or X. I don't know what the most recent framing is, @dgannon2016. And just to say again, in addition to the upcoming review, that the UK book launch is taking place at the Irish Cultural Centre in London and Hammersmith on the 29th of November. I will be in conversation with Roy Foster. I've provided a link to the launch. You can buy your tickets there. It promises to be a very interesting and eventful evening. And I'm looking forward to seeing as many of you there as possible and to fielding more of your questions on that evening.
Thanks, Dara. I'm just going to plug unmercilessly the remaining events programme. Anybody who would like to find out more about what's happening within the Liverpool Irish Festival, please visit liverpoolirishfestival.com/events, and please do follow us on @LiveIrishFest on any social media channel where we have a presence. We would love to see you at more events. Dara, I hope we will see you in next year's festival. Next year's festival will be based on departures, so thinking hats on there for any connections we can make. I'd really like to welcome everybody to now unmute and thank Dara with a great round of applause for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much. Pleasure is mine.
But yeah, we've got lots more coming up. If anybody would like to see Brendan Behan represented on stage, we've got that at the Tongue coming up this Saturday. There's lots and lots to watch. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming. You're getting lots of applause. Dara, I'd also welcome you to read the chat. There's lots of praise for what you've said, and great thanks for a really memorable presentation. Thank you ever so much. Dara and I are going to stay on now, but we invite everybody else to go and make a cup of tea and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for being here.